So, Ash, will we know when everybody's joined us?
Yeah, we're live now. So we have
Live now. Wonderful.
51, 53, 54. Yeah. So
Great. So
everybody's joining as we speak.
let me know when you want us to start. Give people a chance to check
Yeah,
in.
sure. So hi everybody. So yeah, if we just give it another minute or so, just to let everybody finish joining, and then Joe will be kicking off this webinar. Okay, Joe, I reckon let's go.
Wonderful. So welcome everybody. You'll be able to see the panelists in the Zoom screen, but not each other. So I just want to say that this is part of a series of webinars that we're hoping to hold from the MoVE project. The MoVE project is mobilising volunteers effectively, and we were funded by the Economic and Social Research Council to work with local authorities and the voluntary sector to look at how volunteers were being deployed, recruited, mobilised to respond to the issues for communities that were coming up as a result of the pandemic. And a few weeks ago, you'll see that we released our first report, which is about lessons from lockdown, and we had lots of key findings in there. But one area that we were particularly interested in and has received a lot of attention is the vital role that's been played by communities in responding to community-based needs during the pandemic. And a lot of the organisations that we did the research with were really keen to understand how to support this swell of volunteering and to kind of build it into moving forward to dealing with the second wave, which I think we're well and truly in the middle of now, and building it towards recovery. So we've had lots of rich examples in our research about how local authorities and the voluntary sector are trying to work with community volunteers, like informal volunteering around mutual aid, good neighbourliness, community connectors. And we've put together a small sample of some of those really nice examples today. And this is the panel that you can see in front of you. I just want to say a few things about how we're going to organise today. So I'm going to chair the presentations, and then Harriet, who you'll all know, who is the researcher on the project, he's going to be fielding the questions. So you've got an opportunity to fill out questions in the questions tab on the Zoom system. There's also a chat function as well, so please do use that. And Harriet will then kind of try and collate your questions and present them to the speakers. So the webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded onto onto the MoVE webinar space, which is hosted by doit.live. And oh, sorry, I've just got a flash up to say my internet connection is unstable. I hope you can still all hear me. And that's part of the Enabling Social Action ecosystem. Thank you. So as I said, our panelists are visible and audible, but because there's such a large number of people who have registered for this webinar, I think we've had 130 apply to register, and quite a lot of those have joined us today. We can't possibly, unfortunately, have an interactive space with everybody who's on the webinar. So, but you can post your questions, as I've already explained. Also, Harriet's reminded me very importantly that if you were interested in tweeting about the webinar, that would be really great as well. And you can use the hashtag MoVE, M small case V large V large E. So before I introduce the speakers, Ash Scott from Do It Live is facilitating this webinar for us, and Do It Live are also partners in the MoVE project. So I'm going to hand over to Ash briefly.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, just really quickly from me before you hear from far more interesting people than I am. But so yeah, I mean, we're really proud to be kind of partnering on this webinar series with Joe and the team. You know, it's a fascinating subject, and it totally aligns to what we're trying to do as an organisation. So just a quick summary of who we are, so you understand why we're here. So many of you probably know of doit.org, which has been around for kind of 15 years as the biggest volunteering platform. We're now doit.life, so we've been busy beavering away for the last couple of years to create a kind of the next solution to not just volunteering, but wellbeing more generally, and particularly around this kind of time of severe needs. So our thing really is to make it easier for people to find good things to do and to connect with others, ultimately meaning that it improves their health, well-being and happiness. So a key objective for us is we're really trying to be the digital rails for civil society, if you like. We're all about connecting. That's why these meetings for us are amazing, because there's such a broad range of different types of organisation, different roles within local authorities, but all having a discussion around the same topic here. And as a platform, really, we try and bring all of those things together. So we work with local business, local authorities, about 50,000 formal charities, mutual aid groups, communities themselves. So we bring all of those things together. So we're all about removing silos is our kind of platform objective. So as Joe mentioned earlier, we're really, as well as doing that kind of consumer volunteer element to it, we're really passionate about connecting the individuals and organizations that are out there making a difference and making decisions on how we take findings of things like the MoVE report forwards and enable us to actually implement some of those solutions on the ground. So we're excited about you guys kind of getting really involved in the ESA ecosystem. I think that we'll be sharing some stuff later on about how you can join kind of post-webinar groups and continue conversations and discussions. So again, that's probably enough from me, but great to meet all you guys and looking forward to the rest of the series.
Thanks, Ash. I think that gives us a really good introduction to do it. The other thing I wanted to say is that we've got 4 speakers on our panel today, and we've given them 5 minutes each. And the reason why we've done this is because obviously they could tell us an awful lot more than that, but it's so that we've got chance for you to be able to ask questions, and we can have a nice interactive Q&A. As interactive as it can be on a webinar system, not quite as good as being here in person. But so I'm going to introduce our first speaker then, and that is Kevin Wells. And Kevin is the Acting Strategic Manager for the Vibrant Communities Programme in East Ayrshire Council. So Kevin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Joe. I think in terms of through this lockdown, our journey, and it really has been a journey, because I don't think we've reached a station yet or an end destination. In that sense, it's been quite a interesting and ever-changing journey, shall we say. There's been plenty of landscape that we went by. I think rooted in the heart of that, and in the heart of the work that we have been doing in East Ayrshire is wrapped around about our communities, built upon that kind of foundation of good community development work. It need to be said. We very early on put a call to action to our communities in terms of needing support. We knew the pandemic was going to be quite cruel to our communities, and we knew we couldn't do it ourselves. And in that sense, we'd had about 6-7 years of developing a relationship with communities prior to that, and that's why Vibrant Communities itself was established back in 2013. Our call to action was literally sending staff out to known groups and community organisations in our local authority area and ask them, can you play a part in this response? And if you feel you can, what do you think you can do? And what kind of support do you need? In that sense, that was on a Wednesday, and by the Monday morning, we had over 70 groups signed up to be part of our resilience network. That was over 400 volunteers. In that sense, some groups were really small in terms of what they could give over. Some were in the dozens, and that, so it was as whatever the local community felt they could give over or support. That grew to 120 groups in a small local authority area. And to give you an indication of East Ayrshire, we're a urban local authority, semi-rural, semi-urban, with 2 main settlements within the authority. Population of about 120,000 residents, a staff workforce in the council of about 6,000. In that sense, we have quite significant pockets of deprivation. But we were asking communities to support us from across the board. We knew there was a whole wealth of skills and talents in our communities because we'd been working with them for quite some time. And also over 70% of our workforce reside in our local authority area. So we know those skills and talents there and untapped potential. We were overwhelmed, I think, in terms of the how up for it they were in terms of getting involved. And some of that was just simple, I'll happily go my neighbour's shopping. We were supporting them with postcards to put through their neighbours' letterboxes in terms of gathering what support was. It was very fluid. And I think one of the things we learned from this is don't be prescriptive. It really is go at the pace that your local community can go at. It really is about supporting whatever way you can. And to be honest, our red tape went out the window. Our governance was still there, but actually the red tape went out the window. We empowered people to make decisions, and we trusted people, and we trusted our community because they knew what they needed in the local streets. And that's where it did. This became a real issue about local, because people were locked in their houses, and so they couldn't go that far. Resources were really the local shop, etc. So everything became about your neighbours. It was your neighbourhood. And there was a massive campaign on volunteering done by the Scottish Government through Red Cross. And that threw up another 800 volunteers. To be totally honest, they landed on our doorstep. And at first it was, don't know what to do. But actually the right thing to do with that was to feed it back into itself. These were local people who wanted to help out in their local communities. So we fed those individuals back in to use local resilience groups. Now these various different volunteers, they were doing shopping, they were picking up prescriptions, they were doing dog walking, they were pulling out people's bins for the uplift, etc. Everything and anything. And I suppose what we needed to do is we needed to put some resource around that. So we created a £500,000 support fund, which, to be honest, if you applied for it, you could have the money in your bank account within 3 days. The application was an online one-pager. We made sure we needed the absolute minimum to make sure that we did things properly, but it wasn't about creating barriers. And actually, the money went out the door, and it was going out the door for food, for basic essentials. The maximum anybody could apply for was £5,000, but no, everybody was actually applying for the maximum. They were only asking for what they needed, and that was a big learning curve for us. Because you automatically think, oh, they're just going to apply for the top level. They didn't. In that sense, there was respect. And I think what we took for it is that flexibility. There needs to be that kind of swarm of starlings. It moves together, but it moves in all different directions, and you just need to go with it. So for our local authority, which, to be totally honest, is a bureaucratic nightmare at times, we had to just change our culture. We had to adapt quickly to meet the needs. And I think we have helped save lives, because if you look at our figures in terms of COVID through the initial lockdown, etc., in comparison to our neighbour, not so much our neighbour, but our family of authorities who are similarly sized, etc., similar issues, we were outperforming in terms of our COVID deaths, etc., in terms of we were a better place. We were in with the posh councils, to be honest. And the only thing that I would say, did differently is we trusted our communities. We worked with our communities, and they stepped up in that sense. There's lots of learning for us, and each of the council departments are now looking at the recovery and renewal plans. And every single one of them is how do we work with our communities to make that. I was overseeing a lot of that work, and probably was seen as the second largest directory then within the council when we took in our volunteers, our community volunteers. In that sense, that workforce became the second biggest workforce in the council, just after education. And that's phenomenal, because that was people giving up their time. That's over 1,300 volunteers throughout our authority. You know what I mean? Quite phenomenal in that sense. And I think for me, it really is, we need to look at our bureaucracy, because that puts people off and actually puts barriers in its way. We need to trust our people, and we need to fundamentally, as local authorities and public sector, remember we are public servants. We are there to serve our communities. And I think sometimes we need to forget we're not always the people who know best. Professionals aren't always the answers. And actually, a lot of our professionals go back and become residents in our communities in that sense. So big cultural change for local authorities, I think, was the lessons learned for us. Joe, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but happy to answer any questions.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. That's absolutely brilliant, and really chimes with what we've heard from lots of people that we've interviewed. And the other big thing that came out of our first report, obviously, was you know, how you stop that bureaucracy from creeping back, because it seems to be so essential if you're going to be able to work in a more embedded and co-produced way with communities, that bureaucracy really has to not come back in the way that it used to be. So anyway, that's enough from me, because it's not me giving a presentation here. Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm going to keep all the questions to the end, if that's okay. And then I'd like to introduce Nick. Nick Sinclair is the Director of Local Area Coordination Network. And we've heard some amazing things about how the network members have been able to work in a partnership way with communities during the pandemic. So I know Nick's going to tell us much more about that.
Thank you, Joe, and hello everyone, and thanks Kevin as well. I think a lot of what I'm going to be sharing here is going to be building on a lot of what you were saying there, Kevin. I love that swarm of starlings analogy. I think that's brilliant. And I think that's going to be reflected in what I'm going to be sharing here. And I think I'd like to share with you 3 key reflections, if I can, based on what we've heard and seen from the 100 or so local area coordinators based in communities, but working for various councils who are part of our network. And I think they have a really interesting perspective and insights based on the fact they've got a foot both in 2 worlds. So one very much within the communities they're rooted in and serve, but also within the wider service system and the institutions that surround those communities. I've also been reflecting and preparing for this on our timeline that we co-produced as a network during the first 100 or so days of the crisis. And I'll put a link in that in the chat at the end if you're interested in checking that out, because I think you might find that an interesting reflective resource for some of you. So my first reflection is this: you cannot beat naturally occurring, pre-existing, mutually supportive relationships, especially in a time of crisis. And nor can you easily systematize that care in a way that maintains its essence either. And the reasons you can't do that is because the assumed and shared accountability between 2 friends, neighbors, families, whoever, becomes one that is organizational. And with that comes implied risk, and that's risk that must be managed. And with that comes the requirement for process. And all of that takes time and often funded resource to sustain it, doesn't it? So local area coordinators have told us that the reason why neighbourly responses, as Kevin describes there, were so quick is because people really didn't give much thought to all of that at all. They just did what they saw had to be done based on their existing relationships, their local knowledge and trust, and also what they saw from their own front door. But we also heard from them that the confidence to do that was very much bolstered by the connected presence of the local area coordinator, who is already there alongside the community. And I'll talk a bit about that at the end of my last point. Now, none of that is to disparage the value of formally organised volunteering groups, which local area coordinators have also been supporting too. And I'm a passionate advocate for volunteering. I've been a volunteer manager in my previous life, and I've been volunteering myself since I was 18 years old. So I'm knocking on 2-3 years now. Volunteering has its vital place during this pandemic, and it will continue to do so. And it's a fundamentally important part of the fabric of our society. And it's a superb tool for organising people's care, which takes me on to my second point about how that care has been and is being organised. COVID has shown us that people obviously do care greatly about their neighbours and their communities, even if they don't even know them. And this is in spite of the absolute rubbish that we've been fed to the contrary over the past few years by those who seek to divide us in pursuit of their own agendas. All we saw during COVID was a huge appetite for contributing, and local community organisations and more formal mutual aid groups that were constituted provided the structure that was arguably needed in many places to organise that in a meaningful and safe way. However, we also cannot ignore the fact that there was and is some very understandable, very natural, very human politics occurring between groups, which is an unhelpful distraction from what people were trying to achieve and what they are continually trying to achieve. But where we saw less of this in our network, and where we saw more collaboration and therefore more energy being channeled in a positive way, was where relationships and trust already existed prior to the pandemic. And this takes me to my last point. It is, and always has been, all about relationships. For us, the relationships that we've been particularly interested in observing are those between the individual, community, and the voluntary and statutory institutions that surround them. And where we saw direct, strategic prior investment into the mechanisms that built these relationships in a whole system way was also where we saw faster, more effective, more sustainable responses where everyone, individual citizens, communities, and institutions played to each other's strengths and worked far more collaboratively together. So my summary points then: you can't beat natural caring relationships and communities, especially during a time of crisis, but just generally anyway, natural is best in terms of our own lives, our own friendships, our own relationships. The second point, sometimes we do need to organize ourselves formally, and that is a good thing too, but we should avoid that being instead of or in lieu of opportunity to build natural reciprocal relationships. And my final point, planned investment in relationship building that intentionally brings communities, people, and systems and structures together is what is clearly needed to ensure speedy and effective responses in times like this, where everyone plays their strengths and everyone has an opportunity to make their contribution.
Thank you very much, Nick. And oh, well done on timing. You were only 4 minutes. That's really good. I think you raised a lot of really important issues there, and I could see Nicola smiling and nodding, and it's quite fortuitous. I think that Nicola's presentation comes next because I think they are building upon each other, the things that you're having to say. So I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to hand over to Nicola and to Alice. Nicola is the strategic lead. The strategic lead for partnerships and participation in Islington Council, and Alice is the community partnerships manager there. So I'm going to hand over to them now.
Thank you, Jo. And before I hand over to Alice to start our section of the presentation, I noticed there was a question in the chat bar around I think it was that point about affluent councils, posh councils, compared to those with a higher level of deprivation. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of context about Islington, because I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with Islington on the ground. And apologies if I'm saying things that chime against or confirm what you already know. So Islington nationally has is sort of known in the media as being sort of leafy and affluent, and everybody's shopping and eating in Gales and what have you. But actually the picture on the ground in Islington is very, very different. It's not something to be proud of. We have the highest rate of child poverty in all of the London boroughs, but that's to give you a flavour of the reality of the lives of our residents, in that you have very, very affluent people living literally cheek by jowl, next door to each other, street by street, with some of the poorest people in the capital. And so that that's sort of quite an interesting dynamic that we're also working with. We don't have like one area that's got lots of wealth and one that's got poverty. It runs all the way through. Anyway, I'm hoping Jo won't count that against our time. Alice, over to you.
Thanks, Nicola. So Nicola and I are going to do a bit of a double act here. So as Nicola said, Islington is a very diverse inner London borough, and I think it's really important to say that it's a borough with a very rich history of community-led action. And mutual aid groups are certainly a contemporary example of this, and a really significant part of the landscape of support that's available to residents in this current context. So there are 12 mutual aid groups in Islington, and each of them cover a ward or a pair of wards. And they emerged the week before the first national lockdown, offering people self-isolating with support getting food or medicine or a friendly phone call. Mutual aid groups posed a challenge to local authorities, so rapidly set up, no formal structures or policies, and horizontally organised. And I think we could perhaps say that that's in many ways the antithesis of local government. And certainly that was how some in mutual aid groups undoubtedly saw it. So the question of how the council worked with mutual aid groups was contested. And in Islington, there was nervousness from some of our elected members, whilst others had played a key role in their local ward level groups from the outset. So our decision to work with rather than against or around mutual aid groups, kind of with their consent and respecting their autonomy, certainly had aspects of pragmatism to it. The groups hadn't asked for our permission to exist. Issues around safeguarding seemed best handled through offering support, and we certainly would have alienated large numbers of residents if we'd gone over the top of them and set up a parallel volunteering system. And I think talking about, kind of reflecting on our own experiences of people that live in communities, I mean, I didn't think delivering groceries to my elderly neighbour was something that I needed a DBS check for. So why would other people have thought that? But I think, so there obviously are those pragmatic reasons, but I think it's also very much around reflecting the approach we want to take to working with communities. So, if you talk about resilient, self-supporting communities, but then you're not prepared to take some risk when residents actually do come together in large numbers to look out for each other, kind of doesn't feel quite right. So when our coronavirus helpline opened on the 21st of March, mutual aid groups sat as part of the response underneath, alongside the council and established voluntary sector groups. So this necessitated some rapid phone calls to individual groups to check that they wanted to do this. So we couldn't assume that they wanted to work with us either. But I think very positively they really did, and this was certainly the beginning of relationships between mutual aid coordinators and officers. Just pass over to Nicola for the next bit.
Thanks, Alice. So we'd already been working on a programme in Islington called Fairer Together. It's very similar to some of the work that authorities are already doing here around integrated service offers, locality-based working. And so what we very quickly did was we grouped we thought about how we needed to support the mutual aids in a way that would still recognise their independence. So we grouped the ward-based mutual aid groups according to 3 footprints in Islington, and we gave each of those groups a named link officer, and that was somebody in the council that they could phone. And certainly in the first 2 weeks we were on call 7 days a week, but they could phone them at any time to ask for practical support, to just speak to somebody if they're not sure about anything, or if they're struggling, or also if they want to try and link in with others in the system. Quite early on, one of our members led with some of the mutual aid groups around thinking about keeping safe and safeguarding. So they, although it was led by them, they also sought advice from the council safeguarding leads and from public health as well. And so that was, very much practical advice around COVID-19 safety, but also about the fact that they may be encountering situations where they're worried about people, about their well-being, and also their own well-being, their boundaries and their personal safety as well. So collectively we helped to provide develop some advice on keeping safe in those ways. We gave advice on how to handle data so that their own personal details as volunteers, as well as the details of the people they were helping, was protected. We provided them all with burner phones, and as many as they needed on request, and we covered the cost for those so that they wouldn't have to give out their personal phone numbers, and also so that they could have something that they could share around between them, so that they could have some downtime for themselves as individuals. Again, through that link officer, we provided that direct line in case they were seeing people that they weren't sure about how to support, or they had a worry that they just wanted to talk through. And then finally on that point, we made sure that it was really clear how they could link into our core offer of We Are Islington if they needed to refer someone on for additional support. And that leads me to our sort of second point, is that we recognise them as being part of an ecosystem of support and offers, some of which was led by the mutual aid groups, some of which was led by our community centres and networks, and some of it was led by the council and other public sector partners. What we did do was, on our directory, we put sort of a little bit of information for residents. So all mutual aid groups were listed on the council's directory, but we did put some information that explained that they were independent, street level, resident-led groups, and what they could expect from those groups in terms of the type of support they would give, but also things like no one will enter your house, no one will do X, Y, and Z that would ring alarm bells otherwise.
Nicola, sorry, this is the point when normally I'd hold up 1 minute to go, so
that's fine. Yeah, no, that's totally fine. And then the final bit that we did was we provided them with a regular newsletter, and the content was on request by them, so they would say what they needed to know more about, so we'd get that information to them. And we delivered regular training sessions so that they could understand system processes and demystify those a little bit, be aware of what other support was available to them and to residents, so things like bereavement counselling and other wellbeing counselling and practical offers, and then a space for them to connect with each other. So I think Alice is just going to quickly do a cheeky 1 minute on the lessons learned.
Yeah. So I think, as others have said, the relationships formed between council officers and mutual aid coordinators have been absolutely key. So forming relationships of trust have meant that coordinators raise issues or complex cases when that's needed, but it's also allowed us as a local authority to kind of check things with groups. So rather than assuming that something we propose would work, or be well received, providing a space to kind of check that back. I think using the right language has been really important. It's certainly been a lesson to me in how much jargon we use in local government, and a kind of sometimes unthinking use of kind of us and we. I think support to groups needs to be very flexible and responsive. If you offer to help with issues or cases, you've got to be ready to follow through. So we've had missing persons cases that we've dealt with, or navigating the complexities of assisted bulk rubbish collection during lockdown. So I think you've got to have the officers who are ready to actually follow through when you say, if something's not right, tell us. I think some really interesting things around the kind of flows of information between the community and local government. So we've had to work through the issue of passing information back to groups when they've referred cases to us. And also on information, we need to share key updates with groups, but not treat them just as conduits of information between the council and communities. I think it's really made us reflect on the role of the state and what the difference is between established voluntary sector organisations and community groups. Certainly a need to respect autonomy of community level groups. And also I think this question of, yes, mutual aid groups are an incredible example of resident-led action, but this can't be about offloading our responsibility as a local authority onto the community. Partnership working, I think, happens best around shared practical issues, and I think mutual aid, the connections that have formed quite organically between mutual aid groups and local food projects are kind of one example of that.
Alice, are you on your last point now?
I'm
really sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So just very quickly to finish with how we're taking this forward, I think there's been a need to kind of accept that things ebb and flow. So I think the question of kind of how do we sustain mutual aid groups implies that there's a we who can sustain these groups. And I think actually groups will change. They're likely to organise around new priorities. And, it's perhaps for us to think about how infrastructure, like, for example, community centres can help here. And I think, this move to try to be more genuinely collaborative, so actually co-organising and co-facilitating events, has been where we're kind of getting to now, instead of us kind of putting events on for groups. And finally, I think that working with mutual aid groups has had a real impact on our policy thinking, so including how we think about the council's relationship with active residents and what the importance of neighbourhood and place is.
Thank you. Alice and Nicola. Yeah, lots of food for thought in there, particularly like the not offloading onto informal volunteering point. I think that is just so important and something we've been trying to push ourselves as well. So quickly on to Claire. Claire Swales is our last speaker, and Claire is Head of Health and Wellbeing at PAVO, which is Paris Association of Voluntary Organisations, obviously based in Paris, and they've had some really interesting stuff going on, which Claire's now going to tell you about. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Jo. Diolch yn fawr. Bore da pawb. Good morning, everybody. So just to give you a Paris context, actually, and it's not Paris, it is Powys. It does get mixed up now and again. It's okay, Jo, you didn't say that, you're all right. So the population here in Paris is 132,000 people. It's 5,200 square kilometres of land, and it takes 2.5 hours to drive from the north of the county to the south of the county. So that brings a massive challenge in itself in terms of delivering services. We have no district general hospital in Paris, so access to health services is a huge issue as well. We've got to go out of county and there's no A&E. So that just gives you a little bit of context of what we're seeing here in Paris. But actually, in Paris, we work really well in partnership. So the Community Voluntary Council, the umbrella organisation for third sector organisations here, works well with our County Council and our Paris Teaching Health Board. So Wales is actually split up into regional partnership boards, and we're very lucky actually that given Paris and the size it is, we have one health board, we have one local authority, and we have one CVC, which really helps, and that doesn't replicate in other areas of Wales. So we currently know, because we have the Paris Volunteer Centre based within PAVO, that we have around 4,000 voluntary sector organisations within Paris, and that ranges from your little small tea and chat group up to the larger organisations. A third of our population siarad Gymraeg, speak Welsh, and more than 50% of the population already volunteer in one way or another. So I guess with the onset of COVID, that brought its own challenges around people who were already volunteering, and how could we engage with those volunteers and encourage more people to volunteer. So what happened here was that just before COVID really hit, we were approached by our regional partnership board to say, can you set up or assist in leading on what they called the Community Sector Emergency Response Team, CSERT for short. And that was a partnership of the third sector, the council and the health board. Within my team, we have 13 community connectors, so like your local area coordinators then, and they work out of each of the 13 localities that Paris is split into. So we already had that relationship in those communities with those existing community groups and those existing formal groups, and with all our health and social care partners. Very quickly, what happened was we saw across the county, small informal groups started to set up. And that was 122 informal volunteering groups working alongside the existing third sector organisations. How we managed that was very flexibly and letting them go at their own pace, but providing support. So within our CVC, we have our health and wellbeing team, but we also have a development team. And what we had to do was to redeploy some of our development team across to our health and wellbeing team to able to support those individuals that wanted to come together to offer local-based volunteering. So that was around 3,500 volunteers that were part of those informal groups. And what they were looking for was information around safe volunteering, support around COVID, and delivering support safely. And they were also looking for some support, as we had mentioned earlier on, around safeguarding and what to do and that kind of guidance. So the way we did that was used our community connector team and all those local connections that we already had to get that information out to those local groups. The community connectors had already set up a number of locality network meetings, but we quickly asked the team to expand that. So we went from 4 network meetings to 13. So there's one in each area where all those community groups could come together and share their concerns support one another, and then as the CVC we could give them support as they required. On top of that, through the Health Board and the Council, we were asked to recruit what they called formal volunteers. So that was volunteers to help in health and social care settings, support within our hospitals, support within our nursing and residential care homes, volunteer drivers to work for the Health Board. And we did that through the volunteering, Wales Volunteering website. And we recruited 450 what we called formal volunteers, that should the need arise within the statutory services, we had those volunteers that would go into those settings. That actually required a bit more work. So a number of those posts did need DBS checking. They did need references, but thankfully with our development team, we were able to make that happen. So very much supporting the local groups then around their prescription collection, shopping. Our community connectors were receiving referrals. So prior to COVID, we used to get around 230 to 250 referrals a month. In April, we received 1,700 referrals. So actually those, are you going to tell me to hurry up?
Sorry, Claire, yeah, sorry. Just, you know, a few more points, if that's okay. I want to give people a chance to hear their questions answered.
Sure,
so
no
thank you.
So those informal groups that set up and our connections through the community connectors was absolutely vital. So for me, the lessons learned, I'll move on to that quickly, was keep as flexible as possible. Let's try and get rid of the bureaucracy, as we've heard before, because that actually makes things a lot easier. And I think coordinating it through the CVC made that easier in itself. And volunteers bring a huge range of skills and experience, and they're actually professional in their own right. I get very cross and irate when I hear partners say, oh, and the third sector, oh, and perhaps we'll ask volunteers to do this. And it's actually the lowest possible common denominator. You think, actually, we've got a lot to offer, and everybody needs to remember that. So I'll leave it there for now, because it'd be good to have the questions. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Claire. Really great presentations. I've enjoyed all of them. And I think that we've got quite a lot of questions coming through. There's more than we have the time to cover here. So we're going to post them up on the interactive site, and hopefully people will continue having debates and answering those questions for each other there as well. So Harriet, I'm handing over to you, I think now, aren't I? I'm not going to ask the question that we were going to ask. I'm going to prioritise everybody else's questions because they're more important. So,
yeah, thanks everyone. So I've done my best to sort of lump them into themes because there's so many, so that we can try and cover as much as possible. So something that's really interests me, and I think the speakers will have something to say about, is this kind of notion of balancing cutting the red tape, as Kevin described it, and kind of loosening the bureaucracy whilst maintaining safeguarding of volunteers. Kind of how do we overcome that bureaucracy whilst maintaining the appropriate safeguarding and ensuring that people are kept safe? I wondered if anyone wants to come in on that. You'll need to unmute yourself, whoever.
Harry, I'm happy to make a bit of a comment on this one. I think what we need to also we need to be careful that we don't over-organise what is good society, good neighbourly conduct, people looking after each other, kindness. A lot of this doesn't need to be organised in that sense. And I think as long as we provide support where it needs, what we did in terms of the governance safeguarding was we gave every volunteer a handbook in that sense, and some clear guidance. When we put out promotion, we inform people won't be coming through your door. You shouldn't let anybody in. In fact, actually the guidance, etc., was that you don't let anybody in your door in that sense. So we just need to be careful that we don't over-organise this work. I think it's vitally important. We're talking about people helping each other. It's kindness, and that can be seen as volunteer, and it can be seen as a good act, etc. But it doesn't always need to be under a pile of bureaucracy, etc. And as councils need to think differently, because we cause a lot of this. And we create the systems which are usually massive hurdles for people. In that sense, it is important that we promote and we make people aware of safeguarding, so that people can make their own decisions and are able to assess their risk, etc. But we just need to be careful.
Yeah, I think if I can just quickly come in on that, actually, that we certainly saw that here, Kevin, where we were recruiting the formal volunteers for health and social care, that actually the processes they wanted us to put in place actually put a number of volunteers off. And rather than losing those volunteers completely, we would introduce them to their local informal group. So that worked in that way. But certainly, yeah, the bureaucracy does put people off. You've got to be careful whilst maintaining people's safety.
Nick, did you want to come in on that? Nick and then Nicola, did you want to come in? Because Nick, I noticed you took your microphone off mute.
Yeah, so did Nick want to go first?
No, you go ahead,
No.
Nicola, please.
Oh, okay, thank you. So we had almost like a dual process where you'd got, so we recognised that the mutual aid groups had essentially, although they were very, very committed, it was a very, very informal status as volunteers, and anybody could join and do this. But we also recognised that there were, for some people, you would need things like DBS checks or something that was more formalised. So we had a parallel system of community runners, which were volunteers that we were able to fast track through a DBS process, and do a fast track induction as well with our local VCS organisations, very much led by them. And then they were able to step in on some of the more complex offers, things like delivering oxygen saturation tests on behalf of GPs or doing befriending phone calls to particularly vulnerable people.
Thanks, Nicola. Okay, I'll try and move on to the next question. So, sorry, you're muted, Joe. If you're trying to.
Sorry, Nick, did you want to come in there? Because
I don't.
you did. You did.
Yeah, I don't think I've got much to add on to that. Just other than kind of agree with what everyone's saying there around the more natural you can keep things, the less you have to organise around that, the less you have to apply bureaucracy to something. So the question is, have you thought through all the opportunity for it to be a natural connection in the first place? And is there something that can help foster that and create that opportunity in the first place? And that's, like, as Kevin was saying, just good community development, good neighbourliness. And we can't, the problem is, I find is we don't know what we don't know. So sometimes we assume that these things aren't happening, that social capital isn't there, and we create a whole new system, whereas we haven't spent the time to actually just find out. So it's just about, for me, the most important thing is a process of deep listening to communities and people first, and asset mapping in a really meaningful way, so that you can actually get a sense of what is needed and where are the gaps. And yes, there will be needed formal responses and opportunities for volunteers to play roles within that, and that's really important. And then the safeguarding aspect of that and the bureaucracy around that, you have to just make sure it's proportionate and try and use as much common sense as you can, and try and do that based on trust as much as you can. But I would say that's the same for volunteering roles, regardless of whether it's during a time of crisis or normal times, really.
Great, thanks, Nick. So a lot of the questions have kind of themed around the future, really, and taking this forward. And this question I think is really important, and the theme across all of your approaches is that the importance of that investment that you'd already put in building relationships and trust. And so how can we use the learning from the pandemic to make the case for investment and to create the conditions in which inclusion, connectivity and communities thrive? And maybe how are you, if you are thinking about that, how are you thinking about that right now and taking that forward? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in.
I think for us, a real driving force is it's cheaper. There's a financial benefit in this, and not in the sense that people are doing work for free. That aside, actually, you spend less money in terms of trying to repair things that break down, etc. Actually, the impact on people's health through this positivity, and all the knock-on benefits, so that we know this stuff. This isn't anything new, but actually it's about putting it into action. So if there's a driving force, and we certainly see it, is it's cheaper because it's a better way of life, and therefore all the positive impacts that it has on someone, and the less need for the statutory sectors then to pick up things when things go wrong, etc. So I mean that's the big thing for us, in terms of there's a financial saving in terms of doing things this way different. It costs us money to put the bureaucracy in as well, in that sense, because it's wasted space in that. So for us, there's that cheap thing, but underlining it, it's the right thing to do. It's what should be happening, because it's the right thing to do, in that sense. So there's some fundamentals there that really should be seen as common sense, but we overcomplicate it.
I would agree with that, and add on to that, that I think it's part of the paradigm of the way we kind of deliver services now, and this you have to see clear results from your investment, and invest to save is still a very, very strong rationale in our local institutions, and I think that's a very difficult argument to bring this new way of thinking to that table, but I think it's one that we have to do. And the only way you can do that, I think, is by getting all the stakeholders together somehow to have that conversation, and to do that through a particular lens of something, which I think the community is that lens. And I think we've got that opportunity to really do that now. But it does take certain people to want to have that conversation in the first place, and we can't ignore the power dynamics within all of this. And I don't believe that this has to be just the community doing this, or just citizen action here, and just voluntary community sector here, and just public services here. I think it can be a very whole system approach, but that does take a huge amount of energy and commitment from people to actually think about it, so that actually people can recognize the common sense, as Kevin describes, through those conversations, and through building that trust, that knowledge, that understanding, and seeing the results that happen by working in a much more flexible, creative way alongside people and communities, really, which is what we see through local area coordination. When you bring groups of leaders together from across the system to look at local area coordination, and as soon as they start to see those results coming through, and actually see, well, this is actually reducing demand upon services, because people don't want to use services if they don't have to. And actually there is a hard rationale to that. You can't preload that and prove that in advance sometimes either. So that's part of the whole problem, is I think the way we still kind of try and think that you can pull one lever here and you get this outcome here, and the world is far, far more complicated than that. Yeah, sorry, I could rattle on about all that all day, Joe. Sorry, stop talking.
Yeah, here in Paris, actually, the council became very reliant on the community response through our Community Connectors team. So their first point of call, if you call adult social care, they changed their messaging system that directed all their calls through to us. So we were having that really early conversation with people around what it was that they were looking for, what did they need to support their health and well-being, and then only referring back into statutory services as that need was really needed. But going forward, what we've done is with those involuntary community groups, putting them together to a group called the Community Sector Response Group. So through those networks that we set up, there's a representative of each of those networks and all those informal groups coming together as a whole to say, what is it we need? Where are the gaps? What do we want our statutory partners to do to support us? And then feeding that information up as part of the Social Value Forum, and trying to be that catalyst for more community action. So it'd be interesting to see how that develops over the next months going forward.
Great.
Just following, sorry, can I? Yeah, so Kevin raised some really, I think really, really valuable points there, and just to kind of follow some of that. Like, I feel that actually by trusting mutual aid groups and actually listening, we've actually been people have been better supported in the borough. And actually I think the challenge to us in kind of how we support people, actually a lot of those answers are within the community. We don't always, I think this idea that kind of that we've got the answers, that's really been kind of challenged from the work that we've done. I think the times I've picked up the phone to kind of run through something with a mutual aid coordinator has resulted in actually something better happening. And I think there's huge amounts of within the mutual aid movement in Islington and no doubt elsewhere, huge amounts of kind of skills and expertise, from kind of community organising to people who've had, sort of people's work backgrounds. And I think, actually being able to kind of use and draw on some of that skills and expertise to kind of come up with better solutions has been really important. So I think, as I say, it's not about kind of hanging on to what's happening at the moment. I think things will develop and change, but perhaps, a role for local government is to think about what is some of the infrastructure that can support these groups, things like community centres, which are community resources. They're not our resources. They're resources for our communities. So, how can resources like that be used to kind of support and, as groups kind of move on to the, perhaps a kind of next phase, looking perhaps slightly longer term.
Thanks. If you don't mind, I know we're really running short of time, and I think the reality here is that we are just scratching the surface of this issue, and this is going to be work that we're all going to be building for quite some time yet. And so Harriet in a minute is going to tell you about ways in which we'd like to keep this debate going. But there was a comment made by somebody in the audience, and they're absolutely right about the fact that today we're all sat here talking about how you work with informal community groups, yet we don't have anybody from informal community groups on this panel. And I wanted to kind of take an opportunity to explain that and say that this is work that the MoVE project is going to carry on going forward with. So we're moving into the next phase of the work, and we're going to work in an in-depth way with lots of different good neighbourliness, community connectors, mutual aid groups around the country via some of the local authorities and VCS that have been part of the study so far. And as part of that, we will be having another session like this that really does have their voices at the forefront of it. So I do apologise that they're not here today, but it's because it's part of a big set of work. We are going to be continuing this work. We're going to do some more embedded research. So there'll be lots more on this, because I think bottoming this issue about how we can work more effectively with communities is absolutely vital. And so is the issue that what the investment you put in before makes a difference for what you're able to do during the crisis, and that needs to be evidenced so that we can kind of argue for the kind of support that working in this way, in a relational way, really, really needs. So that's part of the objective of the project. Harriet, we're desperately short of time now. I'll let you come in.
Okay, thanks, Jo. So there's some really interesting questions that we didn't manage to get to around power, changing the social contract, the role of mutual aid outside of a crisis, and we really want to keep this conversation going. So we've created a webinar group on our Enabling Social Action ecosystem, which is hosted at Do It Live. And if you're not familiar with our ecosystem, we're working to create a kind of interactive peer learning platform where people can not only access our research materials and resources from this project and our previous social action research projects, but where we share reports and news and activities across the network, and it's really creating a space for shared learning. So once you've joined there, and you'll receive through email details about how to do that, you can join the MoVE webinar series, and in that group we're going to be asking for feedback on this webinar, ideas for future webinars. You can submit your questions, and panelists will have a chance to look at those beforehand. So that we're not just delivering webinars to you, but you're involved in helping to shape the process, which is really important to us. And we're also going to put up the recording of this webinar there, and we'll keep this conversation going, and I'll post some of these questions in and encourage our speakers to join so we can keep it going. So watch this space. Back to you, Jo. You're on mute, Jo.
Sorry. It takes a while to get it off. Sorry. So first of all, I want to thank all of our speakers, and also Ash for for making this possible today, and for providing us with such interesting and engaging examples. You know, we really are grateful to you. And then I'd also like to say that we have 2 further reports coming out from the project from phase 1. One of them is on models and frameworks for responding to community needs during COVID. It's got some really interesting examples of how responses were developed and what worked well and why, and lots of nice content in there about the detailed responses that people had. And then we have another one that is about the supply and demand kind of flow. So it's the patterns of need and the dynamics of volunteering during the crisis, and they're going to be out this month. One's going to be out next week, and then the other one a week later, I think. So we hope you'll stay engaged. And our next webinar is going to be about strategies for supporting the voluntary, the VCS sector, the voluntary and community sector, because as we well know, it's experiencing the biggest crisis it's had for generations because of the funding problems and the demand and draw on need of the resources of that sector. So that's going to be our next webinar next month. So thank you everybody so much. I've really enjoyed it. This is a new experience for me and and not as nerve-wracking as I thought it was going to be. So, so thank you all so much, and I do hope you'll carry on talking to us, and we'll keep you informed about what we're doing and how you can connect up with it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Harriet and Nash.
Thanks, everybody.